Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Virtual Gigliotti. This is the first video that we are looking at World War II in 1944. And of course, this video goes right along with part one of our assignment, where we are looking at 9 statements. Some of them are true, some of them are false. And of course, we want to go ahead and make a prediction, whether we think they're true or false, and then examine the text, read the text to correct each one of those statements so that at the end all 9 statements are true. So hopefully you've taken care of that in your assignment, and in this video we're going to go over those 9 statements to kind of get a little preview, a little advanced organizer, if you will, of what we're going to be looking at here for World War II in 1944. So one of the biggest things, of course, that we're going to be talking about is Operation Overlord, or D-Day, happening in June of 1944. And there at the top you see Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower was the Supreme Allied Commander, the man put in charge at the end of 1943, put in charge of the invasion of France. And so he is the one that comes up with the plan to invade France across the English Channel that we'll be talking all about here in 1944. So you want to make sure you're aware of that. Dwight D. Eisenhower was the Supreme Commander of the Allied forces massing in Britain for the invasion of France. Another famous general that we'll come across in 1944, someone we've already talked about in North Africa and then in Sicily, is General Patton. General George S. Patton, one of the most colorful generals throughout World War II. He was known as the fighting general, and he was, in the German point of view, the best American general, the best American commander in the field. However, he had gotten himself into a bit of trouble during the invasion of Sicily when he slapped one of his soldiers who was suffering from shell shock. And so he was sort of put on the bench, if you will, and Eisenhower uses him as a decoy during the D-Day invasion. So he actually leads a phony army designed to fool the Germans into thinking that the real invasion was going to come from Patton and his phony army. And of course, the Germans kind of waste valuable time thinking Patton's still going to invade when the real invasion is taking place. So General Patton leads a pretend army designed to fool the Germans into thinking the Allies were going to land at what was called Calais. We also then, of course, know that the invasion of France, you might remember this from your U.S. class, was known as Operation Overlord. All of these different operations get a code name so that the enemy, the Germans in this case, don't know what it's involving. And Operation Overlord was the code name given to D-Day, or the Normandy invasion, the invasion of France in 1944. So definitely make sure you know those 3 facts. Some of the other things that you're going to be learning about here in 1944 also deal with the Pacific War. Douglas Macarthur, very famous general, another very colorful, very flamboyant general. He was in charge of the army in the Pacific, and he gets, of course, driven out of the Philippines, like we've talked about in our previous lessons. And in 1944, he is going to return to the Philippines despite some heavy fighting and recapture those islands. And one of the famous pictures you see there is of him getting out of the landing craft and sort of wading through the ocean. And when he gets to the beach, he was always a big self-promoter. He had brought his press attaché along with him, and he says to the people of the Philippines, "I have returned." As part of that return, there is the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which we're going to be looking at here in this 1944 assignment, in which the Japanese Navy was very, very badly hurt, to the point where it's going to be very hard for them to operate outside of the home islands. The Japanese Navy, after Leyte Gulf, more or less retreats back to Japan, and is used as a defensive force in case the Americans invade the Japanese home islands. You also see in 1944 the Japanese resorting to what are called kamikaze attacks. The Japanese were fierce fighters. They refused to surrender. They used their loyalty to the emperor as an excuse to launch these attacks known as kamikaze attacks, where these pilots would get into their aircraft and literally fly them into American ships. And those were known as kamikazes, or divine wind attacks. You might remember those from your U.S. class. They presented a fierce challenge to the American Navy. They cost a lot of ships, a lot of lives, and it was sort of a desperate move by the Japanese towards the end of World War II to still turn the tide in their favor. So the Kamikazes would be something that we'll be looking at here in 1942 as well. The last three statements sort of tee up the end of World War II, which of course is coming in 1945. And you can see up there at the top of our map in the first statement, by the end of 1944, Germany is being attacked on two fronts. And we had talked about this back when we did World War I. But Germany's geographical position, if they're fighting with France and England on one end and Russia on the other, and of course you throw in the Americans as well, and it sort of puts Germany into essentially a vice grip, where they're being attacked. Fighting a war on two fronts is really, really challenging. And so that's what's going to happen in 1944. You're going to have the Americans and the British pushing further and further east into Germany from France, and then you're going to have the Soviet steamroller, which is rolling across Eastern Europe through places like Poland and eventually into East Prussia and Germany on the eastern side until eventually they're surrounding Berlin and the German Reich is falling apart. Hitler's last offensive on the Western Front was known as the Battle of the Bulge. Another battle you might remember from U.S. class. So this is following D-Day. Shortly afterwards, Hitler decides he's going to launch another offensive, push the Allies back into France, and he is actually successful at first. They create what's called a bulge, or this big pocket inside of the American lines. Heavy fighting, fierce fighting, which we'll get into. Eventually, like the last statement says, the Germans will lose the Battle of the Bulge. And with that, that's their last offensive on the Western Front. The rest of the time, they're going to be retreating further and further back into Germany. So by the end of 1944, you're going to see the race to Berlin is on. Who can get there first, the Soviets or the British and American forces? So those are the 9 things for part 1 that you need to know about 1944. In your assignment, make sure that all of those are true. Those are great things to know, to study, and to help you better understand the rest of the assignment, which will obviously be going into more details. Also, of course, you want to make sure you watch the other videos so that you have an idea of all things that are happening in 1944 in this assignment. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next time on Virtual Gilead.